You are rolling.
Very good, thank you. Thank you, Director Ben, for that start. So this is the review session for the chapter 11 through 16 Advanced Sociology exam. Again, you can take notes on this for those of you watching. Take notes, put a time signature from the video on the left-hand side, and then write the definitions related to concepts, whatever you want to do. So format-wise, as I mentioned in class, the test is still 100 questions. It's 60 that are matching, and then 40 multiple choice. So there's 6 chapters this time instead of the other 2 tests had 5 for each chapter. So we'll do the 10 matching per chapter. So the first chapter again is chapter 11. That's on race and ethnicity. So I'll just start with going through some of the key terms and concepts for that chapter, and then we'll go to the next one and so on, okay? So obviously, if the title of the chapter is race and ethnicity, those are the 2 key concepts to know, and those are in the matching section. What's the difference between those 2 people here?
Ethnicity is a shared cultural heritage.
Whereas race is
Socially constructed, like, thing that people who share biologically transmitted traits that are members of society.
yeah, so it's race is based on nature, but the definition of race is based on society. Does that make sense? Whereas ethnicity is more based on culture, okay? So then, concepts that go with that include prejudice and discrimination. People mix up those sometimes. What's the difference between prejudice and discrimination?
Discrimination is the action, while prejudice is like, it's like a belief.
Is the belief, yeah. Yep. So unfortunately, there was a special needs guy. It was on the news last night from Chicago that looked like he was like 20 years old, maybe. I don't know for sure, but he was a white guy and he voted for Trump, and he knew these African American guys that didn't like that, so they convinced him to go with them, and then they like beat him up and said like F Trump, F white people, whatever. Okay, so like they're literally recorded on the video saying that. So the beliefs that they have would be what? Prejudice. And when they're like torturing this guy, what would it be? Discrimination, or even more than discrimination, but yeah. So in that instance, that they actually streamed it on Facebook Live.
Yep.
So just a whole bunch of stupid and evil all rolled into one right there. Okay, so what's the difference then between prejudice and a stereotype? Because both are beliefs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the difference between those 2?
Stereotypes like every single person that fits that mold.
No, like, so if I have a stereotype and I have prejudice, I can still believe it towards every single person of a category. So what's the difference?
Stereotype is like to like a big group of people, and it's like one thing to like a group of people, but prejudice can be like about like a single person.
No, not. I mean, they both refer to a whole category of people.
Stereotype doesn't have to be bad though.
That's the key difference. Is it's prejudice is negative, whereas stereotypes can be positive. So to use one that some people mentioned, I think in our explanations today, like for stereotypes, like somebody said white people are good at golf, right? So that's a stereotype. Or I think that same group said Asians are good at math, right? So whereas prejudice would be beliefs that are like, well, white people are crooked or something, right? So that would be a stereotype. Okay, and then let's say that you have bad stuff that happens to you, and every time it happens to you, you blame it on a different group. That group becomes what to you?
Scapegoat.
A scapegoat. Yep. Okay, and then the last thing I'll talk about is with the term minority. What's the key variable with minority? Is it numbers? What is it? Like, is it possible for you to be a minority, but in a place to have like more of you than others?
Yeah.
Because what's the thing they look at?
Is it,
It's like your physical.
No, not necessarily. So for example, like religion, you could be a religious minority, but Like you convert to a religion, you know what I mean? You can change your religion. So it's how much power you have. So the classic example I always use is the Raj in India, the British Raj, where they had like India was part of the British Empire, and there's probably 3% of the population in India in the 1800s was like people ruling, were the British people, and then everybody else was Indian. The Indian people would be considered, from a sociological perspective, the minority there because they don't have as much power. Okay? All right, so that leads us to chapter 12. Chapter 12 is on politics and economics. Again, economics is the social institution that regulates the consumption and distribution of goods and services, whereas politics is where they regulate the distribution of power and how decisions get made. So there's more formal examples of that. For example, government is a more formal example of politics as a whole, but politics is broader than government from the sociological sense. So two of the variables that we talked about in that chapter included types of authority as well as sectors of the economy. So let's start with sectors of the economy. What were the three sectors of the economy we discussed?
Primary, secondary, and tertiary.
Primary, secondary, and tertiary is correct. So give me an example of primary sector and then define it.
Like a farmer.
Okay, farmer. And then what's the definition of it then?
They take like the natural like materials from the earth, basically, and they're the ones that like gather it.
Yep, so farmers, loggers, like people that cut trees down, people that mine, they would be examples of primary sectors of the economy. Okay, so then secondary sectors, they take those goods and they like process them and make them usable for people. So if you work in a lumber mill or a Windows factory, like not where you're writing code for Microsoft Windows, but where you're actually making Windows, or you work in like General Mills, that's based out of cities, they make like Golden Grams and a bunch of different things. Okay, so do you have a question real quick?
Can I move my walker real quick? Some of my notes are.
Yeah, that's fine. Just make sure you leave everything there, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So anyways, that would be an example of the secondary sector. And then the last one, tertiary, what does that mean? What's the definition?
The parts of the economy that involves services rather than goods.
Yep, service-based industries. So what are some examples of those then?
Like
Service.
a grocery store.
What's up?
Like a grocery store.
Yeah, if you were at most employees at a grocery store, the example of somebody at a grocery store I think that would fit different would be the butcher.
Yeah.
So, because they're actually processing the meat, right? That'd be secondary. But most of the people at the grocery store would be tertiary. Accountants, lawyers, teachers, social workers, engineers. If you're not actually building the building or the car, you're running the calculations and designing it, that's tertiary, okay? So there's some multiple choice questions about that also where it'll say like, Taylor does this for a living. Which sector of the economy would she be part of? Okay? And then in the matching section, it's just a few about like what sector it is.
On the test, I know for like matching, it'll say like chapter 12.
Yep.
But then for multiple choice, will it just be random?
Yeah, it's just random. Yep. Okay, so now let's talk about types of authority. First of all, what is authority? Let's define that first.
It's what people perceive, like the power that like it's like perceived. Right?
Power that people perceive as legitimate rather than coercive.
Right. So authority is like a type of power you have over somebody that the average person in a country is going to be like, okay, they should have a say over them. So, if I'm at the grocery store and my daughter's like, I want that, and I'm like, no, and I'm like, you can't do this. If people really know that I'm her parent, they're not going to question me telling her what to do, provided it's not like illegal or unethical or something. But so that's authority. It's a type of power where people perceive it as legitimate. So then if you remember, power is defined as the ability to get what you want, even though people resist you. So like last night I showed up and my wife had a friend over that had kids too, because her friend hadn't seen our child yet, but she had her other kids over. So there's 5 kids in the house. and I walk in, and there's wrapping paper everywhere. Like they got a roll of wrapping paper and like unrolled it, and we're making a mess. I'm like, oh, Natalie, put that away. I go upstairs, I go back downstairs, and she's sitting there naked, like they were gonna wrap themselves up, apparently. I don't know. It's like 6 to 3-year-olds, right? So there's not a lot of logic there. So I'm like, Natalie, put your clothes on. But Dad, put your clothes on. So eventually I just like pick her up and put her in her room, you know? That's power. Like she can't really, she can try to resist, but like it's not gonna work that well, okay? All right, so let's talk about types of authority then. There were 3 main types that we talked about in class. What's one? No, authoritarian, that's like an expression of government power. I mean like 3 sources of authority. Traditional, charismatic, and rational legal. So traditional is like, you know, men have had power traditionally in families, or the king, like it's just who the ruler was last time. Those are 2 examples of traditional authority. Rational legal is something that has some type of logical basis to it. Often it's written down. So like legally and in policy of the school, I have authority over you, right? Like there's policies in the planner that say you have to listen to reasonable requests from teachers. There's also laws that say that if you disrupt the school environment, you can get charged with a crime if it's egregious enough. So that'd be 2 examples of rational legal. And then charismatic is that people follow you because you are like a really good leader, or you're friendly, or you're helpful, or whatever.
So like Martin Luther King would be charismatic, right?
Yeah. Yeah, most leaders have elements of all of that, you know? I think in class we mentioned like Hitler. Hitler actually tries to stage a coup, is not successful, goes to prison for a while after failing in the beer hall push, gets out of prison. While he's in prison, he writes Mein Kampf, right? And then they start to win elections, the Nazis. So he becomes a leader because of the political system. So there's some rational legal element there, right? But mostly for him, it's charismatic. So as evil and crazy as Hitler was, people followed him, right? Okay, so let's talk about what's the difference. Some of these are kind of hard to reword. Okay, hold on a second. In economy, when you have like all one, like part of the economy is controlled by one business, what's that called? A monopoly. Yep. What if it's only a couple of businesses? Yeah, oligopoly. Yep. Because olla means small group in essence, so oligarchy is a system of government where there's a small people group that rules. Like communist nations usually turn into that, where like the central committee plans everything, and that's usually a fairly small group of people. So it's the same thing in an oligopoly. So in that instance, you might have like, they're worried about this with some tech companies, cell phone companies, or like cable providers, because the tendency is for them to like buy out competition and get bigger. So let's say it turns out in the country that you have like Dish Network, DirecTV, and then like 2 big cable companies, right? So that's not as bad as if there was just one, but that's still a lot of power that those 4 companies have, right? So that'd be an example of an oligopoly. Okay, what is a type of government where there's agencies and programs that provide like benefits to the people? Welfare state. Yep, welfare state's correct. Okay. What is a political system that denies people participation in government?
Totalitarian.
Yeah, or authoritarian. Yep. What's a type of occupation that is white collar and prestigious? What's the term for that? It's not just a job, it's a profession. Yep. Okay, that leads us to chapter 13. Chapter 13 is on family and religion. the level of religious devotion that people or a society has is called what?
Is it religiosity?
Religiosity is correct. So if you have a lot of religiosity, you can start to lose that. Like some societies become less religious. Religious is actually a show about that, like a documentary. It's not religious isn't the word. I just misspoke that. But societies become less religious, often over time. What's that process called where societies aren't as religious? Like religious groups lose their power. Secularization is correct. Good. Okay. What's systems of religious belief where they believe that elements of the natural world are actually spirits that can affect humanity? Well, this is common in societies that aren't as developed. So, for example, they see like a...
Totem?
No, that's a term that we'll talk about in a second. But animism, yep. So in animistic societies, it's like they think that like wolves or owls or trees can be spirits that inhabit stuff. So then totems are what?
An object in the natural world collectively defined as sacred.
Yep. So the single object would be the totem. The belief system that involves that would be animism. Okay? All right. What is a social bond that's based on common ancestry, marriage, or adoption?
Kinship.
Kinship, yep. What's the social institution that unites people in groups to help care for each other? Family's correct. What's the way that we track family lines? What's that called?
Descent.
Descent is correct. Good. What's the in the text they talked about a conflict take on Christianity that combines political activism with often socialist or even Marxist principles. It's a type of theology. It was really common in African American communities for a while. It's liberation theology. Liberation theology. Yep. Okay, that leads us to chapter 14, which is on healthcare and medicine. What is the expected behavior for somebody that has an illness? Sick role? Yeah, because you act in a role, right? Like you're an actor acting a role out. Okay, in schools they'll take students, like what we do here, we have people take math tests, look at their math scores, and then if you do bad, they'll put you in a like easier class. But then often you have to do like 2 periods of math. Whereas if you do better, you get in a harder math class. What's that process called? Tracking. Yep. What is the process of like physicians assisted suicide or letting somebody die if they're suffering from a disease? What's it called? Euthanasia. Euthanasia. Yep. Okay.
Is that like the singular of like euthanizing?
Yes. Well, euthanasia would be the broad concept. Euthanize would be the act of doing it. Yep. Okay. What's the difference between education and schooling?
Schooling's like under like in the building with like teachers, but education can be like outside of setting like a building.
Yeah, schooling is the formal process where you get trained by specifically trained teachers, whereas education is the broad social institution that could include a lot of less formal ways. So, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, thanks, Ben. What is it called if you can read and write a little bit, but not well enough to really get along in society?
Functional illiteracy.
Functional literacy is correct. Okay, that's that chapter in a nutshell. Let's go to chapter 15. That's on demographics and population. No, we just did 14. Yeah, so 15 is population and demographics. So what's it called if you live in an area that's like Los Angeles, Chicago, a lot of people, fairly concentrated?
Urbanization.
No, it's just urban. Yeah. The process of people moving to bigger cities is called urbanization. So just outside of a bigger area, so using like Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Michael, Albertville, where the outlet mall is there, what would that be called?
Suburbs.
The suburbs. And then what's the third layer, like my hometown beach?
Metropolis.
No, a beach isn't a metropolis.
Megalopolis.
No, definitely not a megalopolis either. You got urban, suburban, and
Rural.
rural. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, beach is not a metropolis. There's more people in this building on a given day than live in the whole county, probably. So, then in the town for sure. The town's probably 1,100. Okay, what's the term for the study of human population? Demography. Yep. So you'll track that to try to, like, what's a reason why we study demography? What does that help us do?
To find trends, like where people are living.
And then to do what?
To
Predict.
Predict stuff for schools, for businesses, for traffic, all that stuff. So we do that as a school district to figure out where we need to build schools and who we need to train, hire, whatever. Businesses will do that too. Like if you move to an area and you notice there's a whole bunch of people in the like 50-year-old demographic in that area, and you're like, you have money, you want to invest in something, investing in healthcare or retirement homes probably would be a good thing, because in about 10, 15 years that would pay off, right? So demographics helps us to do that. Okay, we talked about two terms by Ferdinand Tönnies, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. What's the key difference?
Gemeinschaft is like when I don't know.
Mineshaft's like close and things that like everyone wants, whereas the shell stuff more like a self-interest.
Yeah, both are types of social organizations where people come together. In Gemeinschaft, it's because they feel like connection to it, whereas in Gesellschaft, it's based on individual self-interest. Yep. Okay, what's the measure for birth rates in a society called?
Fertility.
Fertility. How about death rates?
Mortality.
Mortality. How about like people leaving or traveling from places?
Migration.
Migration. So in migration or out migration, right? What's the study of how, like, the population and social dimensions of a city influence, like, the environment and the physical characteristics?
Urban ecology.
Urban ecology is correct. Good. Okay, that leads us to chapter 16, the last one, which we didn't really do a lot on. I think I posted like some key concepts, and then you watched the video and we kind of broke it down there. So in chapter 16, one of the distinctions they draw is between modernity and post-modernity as well. So the root word there is modern, right? Modernity and post-modernity, or modernity. So what's the difference between those two things?
modernity is changes brought on by the Industrial Revolution, and I would assume that post-modernity is like what it is like after that.
Yeah, but what's the... It is after that, but what's the...
Refers to the cultural traits of post-industrial societies. Postmodern criticism of society centers on the failure of modernity, and specifically science, to fulfill its promise of prosperity and well-being.
Yeah, so modernity is like a worldview or a way of looking at the world that says that with technology and science and more production, we can solve problems, right? Well, we solved some problems, but there's still a lot of problems that came about because of that. So postmodernity is a critical of modernity in essence. Okay, how about man, some of these are hard to. What's Durkheim's term for when you're in a society and there's little moral guidance? What's that called? The term literally means normlessness, or like without norms, without guides for behavior. What's the prefix that means without on a word?
Is it enemy?
Yeah, enami. Yep. So the prefix is a, right? So, and I don't even know, because that's not an English word, right? I don't even know if that's the root word, if like nami means normlessness, you know what I mean? But I just remember that the a means without, so without norms. But again, I don't know if that's the correct translation, but regardless, it works to help me remember what the definition is. Okay. If you're in society and there's like an event that causes a whole bunch of harm to a whole bunch of people, it could be a natural one or it could be a man-made one, but what's that called? A disaster, yep. What is organized activity that encourages or discourages social change?
Right.
No, more broad than that.
Social
Like
media.
Social movement.
social movement, yeah. So like the dudes, if you watch the Vikings game, you saw they like scaled down and hung a banner.
Yeah.
So somebody let him in, probably somebody that works there. So somebody's gonna get fired and probably arrested and whatever. But those guys are crazy. Have you been in the Fargo Dome before? I've been in the like rafters for that, like walking around, and that's a long ways up. Like, and the Viking Stadium would be a lot higher than that too. So it's not. Can't believe they're just hanging there swinging. Like, no, not me. Okay. What is? I forget which ones we did. That's good enough for now. Okay, so that's most of the matching questions. I skipped a few, but okay. That we talked about. We talked about that. Okay. Do you remember how I had a graph in the map where it was the social distance scale measurement? It was trying to show like how biased people are, and it was like, would you accept somebody that's Italian or Jewish as like a family member by marriage, close friend, neighbor, coworker, or you wouldn't like it? You remember that? It was like a scale 1 to 10. Okay. So what did that show us about the trends with college students? Because that measure is for college students.
Eastern European. That would more likely be.
No,
Western European.
the worst two terms, our worst two groups, I believe, were Arab and Muslim, if you remember. And that survey was given after a specific event that the like researchers thought could have influenced that. What was that event? Yeah, the September 11th attacks. So if you remember that discussion we had in that graphic, that would help you answer this question. Okay. Let's see. Some of these are like. I talked about already. I talked about sectors of the economy, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, what's the difference between socialism at a basic level? What's the difference between socialism and capitalism?
Government controls the economy and people control the economy.
Yeah, in socialism, it's collective goals through government control. Capitalism, the emphasis is individual goals through the free market. So in short, in socialism, there's more control, and in capitalism, there's less control. What's a system of government where like there's no government? What's that called? What is it? Anarchy is correct. Yep. What's the difference between polygamy and monogamy?
Monogamy is marriage to a single person. Polygamy is marriage to multiple people.
Polygamy is multiple, monogamy is one. Okay. What if you are married to many men? What's that called? Polyandry, yep. Because poly means many, and andro is like a root word that means male. Okay, remember we talked about the four main theories in Soc, three main ones, and then kind of an offshoot of a micro theory: functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, and exchange theory. In the family, in regards to the family, what would functionalists focus on?
Like how the family works and like how it all like works together to like create like a constant system that works for them.
Yeah, how it helps society to function. Yep. What would exchange theorists focus on in their analysis?
What's the difference between exchange and SI?
SI focuses on the meaning that people create out of stuff, like how they interpret situations, whereas exchange theory looks at it more from a perspective of how people like try to get involved in relationships based on what it brings to them. So in exchange theory, it's like the framework says that whenever you're going into a relationship or interaction, you kind of weigh the pros and cons, and that shapes your likelihood of deciding to do something or not. Whereas in SI theory, it's not so much about that, it's more about how you interpret situations. So you might interpret something as positive, whereas somebody else might interpret it as negative. SI theorists focus more on that interpretation process than the like pluses and minuses element. Yeah. So back to the question, what would exchange theorists say about family? What's one way they could look at the family?
It helps people become socially integrated in society.
That's functionalism. Yeah.
Gives people like a basis for like how to interact with different people.
Yeah, so what's the core of most families now? Like how do families start? Marriage, right? So do we have arranged marriages or not for the most part in the United States? No. So how does exchange theory relate to the start of the family as it relates to marriage then?
So for exchange, like you pick your person.
Combined
so
income.
Yeah, so exchange theory, you like, when you're evaluating who you want to date, potentially marry, propose to, you kind of weigh the pros and the cons. So I think I used the example in class, let's say you went and ate with a group of people at lunch and you're like, yeah, I think this person's kind of cute and I think this person's kind of cute, right? Then you're going to go, okay, this person like does this that's cool, but this is kind of annoying. And this person does this that's cool and this is kind of annoying, you know? And that's kind of this. So exchange theorists believe that everybody does that, but often it's done at like a subconscious or unconscious level. But everybody is doing that when they try to evaluate like who they want to date or potentially marry. So that's what they would focus on, is like how people get into the relationships more than anything. Okay. If you remember from the reading, there was a lady named Jane Elliott that did an experiment in her classroom in Iowa where she basically told the kids, like, one day all blue-eyed people are smarter and they're better. And then she made like people that weren't blue-eyed wear like little symbols that said they had brown eyes or something else. And she wanted to see how that would affect how they would treat each other. And then after a few days, she's like, no, actually the blue-eyed people are like the bad ones and the brown-eyed people are better. This was in like the 60s before they really cared about ethics and research and stuff, right? They wouldn't let you do this now, no way. But what did that show people? What did that study show people? That wasn't, I misspoke, that one wasn't Jane Elliott, but that was a different sociological study. But what did that one show people? How like stereotypes and the groups people belong in can influence how they act towards others, right? Okay, the other experiment with Jane Elliott, and I'm forgetting some details exactly on this, but basically what they told some of the teachers was like, these groups of students are like really smart, and these ones are kind of trouble, and they are not as smart, when in reality they were about the same. And then the teacher's belief about the students going in actually shaped how the students did in class. So the ones that they interpreted as like bad got in more trouble and didn't do as well, whereas the one that were interpreted as good did better, even though there was like really no difference between the two. Okay. What's the relationship between income level in a country and population growth? Like, are the wealthy nations growing a lot? Are they staying about the same? Are the poor nations growing? What's the relationship?
Poor nations are growing a lot, and wealthy nations are slow but steady. Right?
Or they're staying the same. It really depends on which wealthy nation. But in terms of natural increase, the rich nations are, for the most part, either staying the same or shrinking. But countries like the United States, our birth rates are enough that we could grow a little bit, but not as much as if we didn't have a lot of people moving here. So rich nations, their growth tends to mostly come from migration, whereas poor nations' growth tends to come from what mostly? Yeah, birth rates, natural increase. Yep. You know how we looked at population pyramids, right? What if you saw, like China for a while, the number of 0 to 5, well, even now probably, I haven't looked at this recently, but I would bet it'd be the same now. The number of 0 to 5-year-olds and 5 to 10-year-olds that are male is much larger than the number that's female, right? So what does that show you about that society?
Probably favor males more than females.
Yeah, that they have some cultural beliefs that they value males more than they value females. In the text, if you want to flip to chapter 16, there's a box that I want to tell people for the video the page number for this box. But there's a box that has 4 examples of social movements. It's alternative, redemptive, reformative, and revolutionary. And the variable is like how much change?
444.
444? Okay. So there's like 3 questions about those. So it gives you a scenario and then it wants you to identify which type of social movement it is. Okay? So looking at that, if you can see, the 2 variables are how many people are being changed and how much change are you giving the people, right? So if it's a system that wants to have a lot of change for a whole bunch of people, that's revolutionary. You guys see that in the graphic? Okay, what is it if you want a lot of change but only in a small group of people or like one person?
Redemptive social movement.
Redemptive, yep. What if it's like you want a little bit of change but for a whole bunch of people? What is it?
Reformative.
Reformative, and then the last one, I forget what's alternative, but right? Is that the last one? Okay. So now let me give you an example, and I want you to tell me what it would be, all right? In the early 1900s in Russia, the Red Guard, or the Bolsheviks, they become the Red Guard later, but what would that be? I'm assuming that you remember world history here.
Revolutionary.
Revolutionary, yeah, because they did the civil war that turned Russia into communist, right? That's not just a few people, that's a whole bunch of people, and it's a lot of change, right? What about in West Fargo, let's say they did this nationwide, but they put in no sort recycling, you know, those green bins. So what would that be?
Informative.
Because
there's not a whole lot of change, but everyone's involved.
yeah, so really it's not that much more work for you to it's more work than just doing garbage, but it's less work than having to sort the recycling, right? So that's reformative. That's a little bit of change for a whole bunch of people. Okay? So you'll get a couple scenarios where you have to identify which one it is. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's move on. What is the difference between a manifest and latent function? Let's review that first, and then I'll ask the next question.
Manifest is like what's expected and latent is what's unexpected.
Manifest is the intended consequence, whereas latent is the unintended. Good. Okay, so what is a latent function of laws that have been changed that allow people to get divorces easier?
More divorces.
And divorces become more socially acceptable, and there's more of them. Yep. We talked about this earlier, but what's the key difference between prejudice and discrimination?
Prejudice is the belief, discrimination is the action.
Yeah, one's a belief and one's an action. So discrimination, anytime you see TION at the end, that's an action. What is it called where like businesses or colleges will save spots for women or minorities?
Affirmative action.
Affirmative action. Yep. What is it called if you like try to track people by some type of status in order to determine if they're likely to like commit crimes or do something wrong or whatever? Yeah, racial profiling. Yep. Okay, we talked about capitalism and socialism, talked about types of authority. What, in terms of the United States, how would you define that? Capitalist or socialist mostly?
Capitalist.
Capitalist mostly, but is it purely capitalist? No, because the government does get involved in some business decisions, right? So what would the best characterization of the United States be, potentially at least? What do we have? It's another term from that chapter. We have a welfare state. We have a bunch of programs designed to help people, but still largely we have capitalism. Okay, in marriage and housework, let's say you have a male and a female and a couple, and both of them work, right? That's a dual wage earner home. Do they share housework equally? Do men do more work? Do women do more work? How does that look? Like on average across the country. Women do more housework. Yep. Statistically, women do more housework. Now, in addition to that, are there tendencies, are there patterns of what type of work people do based on gender?
Yes.
Yeah, so, and if you look at the data on this, it's fairly stereotypical. Like, who does most of the yard work? Males. Who does most of, like, the laundry and stuff? Females. So, there's a debate about why that is, but that's the trend that we see in most instances. There are some exceptions, but we see that women do much more of the housework. Somebody once said, well, that's because they can tolerate less mess than the guys. If you've seen, like, if you have older brother or sister, maybe you could, because you have one of each that are kind of in this stage.
4 siblings.
But 2 that I know of.
Yes.
Okay, so if, let's say they had an apartment, it was all guys in one apartment, you went there, and then you went, like Leanne had one that was all girls, chances are the girl apartment was a heck of a lot cleaner than the guy one. Is that true? Okay. All right. Let's talk about functions. What were some of the functions of religion that were mentioned? Okay, it provides a level of social control or morality, right? Keeping people from doing bad stuff.
Isn't like charity?
Yeah, helping social support. Yep. What else?
Does like latent functions as well?
Well, yeah, I suppose.
Well, I don't know, like there's like conflict, like war.
Right. Yeah, so socialization. So look at the functions of religion, be able to kind of identify that. We also talked in chapter 13 about the difference between churches and cults. In terms of integration in society, which one is more integrated in society?
Churches.
Churches are much more. In the United States, what's the largest religious affiliation? What religion do most people follow? Okay, but more specific than that. No. Protestant, yep. Canada's more Catholic, US is more Protestant. Of that, Protestant you can break into branches also, right? So what's the main Protestant denomination in the United States? No, in the upper Midwest it is Lutheran. But overall in the United States, which one has the most followers? It's very common in the Southeast. Like if you go middle of Texas, up through like Ohio and over to North Carolina, that's for the most part this religion. Protestant is proletarian, that's a Marxist term.
That's not what I was thinking of, but you feel that.
Baptist is the answer. Baptist is the answer.
Not proletarian.
Okay, what's a manifest? Let's go back to manifest and latent as it relates to education. What's a couple manifest functions of education?
Better prepared for society.
Okay,
Sports.
socialization. Extracurricular activities is, some people think that's latent, but it actually would relate to manifest because it helps to accomplish the goal of teaching people like work ethic and discipline and how to work with people, right? So that's a manifest function. So preparing for the workforce, extracurricular activities, what else?
Socialization.
Socialization is the big one. Okay, how about latent functions?
Matchmaking.
Matchmaking, so relationships.
Daycare
Yep.
for kids. So if you don't have to be out in the world, so it gets kind of like.
Yep. Yeah, healthcare or not healthcare, childcare for kids, good. Okay. In the United States, what is, like if you look at which schools do the worst, what's the variable that they share? Most of them.
Inner city.
Yeah, they're in large urban areas for the most part. There's some exceptions, but yeah. So what about funding? Like how much money is spent on education? Does that influence how people do? No. Washington, D.C., for example, that public school district is the one that they spend the most per pupil, and that's one of the worst performing districts. In terms of federal funding, I don't know how much local goes in, but I know a lot of federal funding goes into education on reservations, and they don't do as well. So there's other things besides money. If you look in the state, like the amount per pupil that West Fargo spends, West Fargo is actually a decent amount lower than Fargo. And I don't remember exactly how we did on some outcomes, but it's comparable. But I know some small towns that are like really high in educational performance, their amount of spending per pupil is like $1,000 less per year, or even more than that than ours is. So it's not like the more money you spend, the better outcomes you get. It's not that simple. So that's not directly correlated. Remember also how we talked about causes of death in the United States? What's the number one cause of death in the United States now? Heart disease. Number two? Cancer, yep. So, United States is a high-income nation, right? In countries where it's a low-income nation, what is the tendency for causes of death?
TB.
Well, communicable diseases, often. Yep. It's not like diseases that affect people when they're like 75, 80, right? Because most people die before they get that far along. Okay, in terms of healthcare costs have gone up a lot over the last 5 years. What's the other thing in the United States that as a percentage has increased? At least as of last year it had increased more, although with the changes in the law and the Affordable Care Act and some of the rates that have increased like this year, I bet the other one probably is more. But what's the other thing that's risen a lot like healthcare?
Insurance.
No. More broad than insurance. It's education. So like colleges, if you look at the tuition rates or how much college costs over the last 5 years, it's gone up quite a bit. I remember when I went, it was fall of '99 when I was a freshman at NDSU. And I want to say my tuition for a semester is like $1,500. So what's tuition now, do you know?
8.
8 or 9.
Per semester.
800?
1,000.
Oh, 8,000? I was like, 800, what? Yeah. Tuition and fees, or is it just tuition?
That's like for like room and board,
Oh, okay.
but just tuition is like,
Probably half that.
yeah.
4,000.
Things like that.
Yeah, which is still like a lot less than some places. But I remember some of my friends wanted to go to like Concordia and stuff, and I was pretty good in band, so I could have got some scholarships for music there. But still, even with some of those scholarships, it would have been
Yeah, it's really expensive.
a lot more. So, okay. What's one of the key, like, so you have a nationalized healthcare system, right? Everybody gets healthcare then. What's the criticism of it?
Higher taxes.
Yeah, higher taxes, it costs a lot, but what else?
More people going to the hospital.
Which then leads to
Higher prices.
Longer wait time.
longer wait times is kind of the big critique of that, excuse me. Okay, we talked about that. Oh, no, we didn't talk about this. Sources of cultural change. Invention, discovery, or diffusion are the three examples. Okay? So invention is like you make something new, right? Discovery is like you discover something. So, for example, let's say just between West Fargo and Horace, on land that West Fargo, like the city, owns for whatever reason, they're like digging for a well and they find like the world's biggest supply of gold. And it's like city owned for whatever reason, right? That's discovery. So it's, do you see how that's not invention?
Yep.
Something that's there, but let's say again, world's biggest supply of gold is discovered and it's like, well, let's say it's actually school district owned land, just to make this analogy work better, right? Like, that would have a lot of cultural change for us, right? They could pay off a ton of debt. We could get like a sports bubble thing to practice in. Like, you know, there'd be a lot of change because of that discovery. But that's different than an invention, right? So what's diffusion then? What's cultural diffusion?
That leads to economic growth.
Well, it's a type of social change, but how is that different from discovery or invention? So I invent something in this culture, I discover something in this culture. Diffusion, if you guys talk about that in biology, right? Cell diffusion, or there's a term where, again, I'm not in science classes, but like some stuff moves from one part of a cell to another. Don't they use diffusion for that? Okay, so it's the movement from one place to another, right? So let's say somebody comes over here, moves here from a different town, and they bring like a technology that nobody had ever heard of before. You know, with internet and stuff, that probably wouldn't happen. But let's say, hey, check this out. That's diffusion. When new ideas or inventions come from a new place. Does that make sense?
So kind of like cotton.
Well, yeah, the triangular trade, like during the Age of Exploration, where they took, I think sweet potatoes were native to Latin America, but then they got brought over to like Scotland and Ireland and Europe, and they grew like crazy there. So that's an example of diffusion. Okay? All right, that is it. Any questions specifically? Okay, Ben, you want to hit stop on that for me? Thanks for coming, guys. So then, as you know, you don't have to do any
Cut.
notes or anything.